the perpetrator isn't always who you expect it to be.
He found a way of committing a crime and getting away with it.
Opening my contacts book for the first time to reveal the secrets of what it really takes to be a murder detective.
He tried to shut the door on me. I put my foot in the door, pushed it open, and we went in.
I'd never come across anything like this.
On the front line, exposing how we solve the most heinous of crimes.
The lesson I took from this case, it's never over till the fat lady sings, and those opportunities still exist if you grasp them.
Welcome to Secrets of a Murder Detective.
The death of Susan Annis in November 1996 was one of London's most challenging cases.
I'm meeting the senior investigating officer on the case to understand what really happened, the challenges, the setbacks, and the tactics they used to bring the killer to justice.
My name is David Cook. I was a detective superintendent with Surrey Police. This case is about a predator. He's someone who looks for an opportunity and takes it, irrespective of who it is or what that person's doing at the time.
David, thanks very much for coming in. Really appreciate it. Thank you. David, so 1999, can you tell me whereabouts you were working then?
I was at Surrey Police Headquarters. I was the overall charge of a number of specialist resources and also one of the force SIOs.
An allegation was made that came to your notice. Can you tell me about that?
There was a DI Sharp at Addleston. He contacted me on the telephone to inform me about an allegation of rape that had been made by a woman while she attended the accident and emergency department at St Peter's Hospital. She believed that she had been raped by a male nurse.
Dealing with allegations of rape is one of the most challenging cases for police officers. You have conflicting interests in the case. On the one hand, it's really important that the officers get hold of forensic evidence. But on the other hand, you have to think of the welfare of the victim. They've been through a traumatic experience, and it's because of this that only specialist officers will be used for this purpose. What does she say happened?
She had about 24 hours of severe stomach pains, and no matter what she took, they didn't go away. So her boyfriend, who was with her at the time, persuaded her to go into the A&E department at St Peter's Hospital.
Was he with her when she went?
Yep, he accompanied her in there and was with her during the reception process, and then both sat outside waiting to be called in. Around about 8 o'clock in the morning, we had a male nurse came out and invited her into an operating room within the accident emergency department. He had asked for a urine sample and then suggested that he was going to take blood. She believed that she was being injected with something. She started to question this, but then she started to feel woozy. She lost consciousness, she woke up. She remembers touching between her legs, and then she lost the degree of consciousness again. She woke up. She believed that he penetrated her. In other words, raped her.
So, I mean, that's quite an allegation, isn't it? What was his version of events?
The male nurse, who was Kevin Cobb, he denied any physical interference with her. He denied sexual assault. He denied rape. Basically, he was going against everything that the victim was telling us.
So, from his account, everything was just normal. He was examining her as he should have been.
He did say that she looked as though she'd fainted and wasn't well, and that this was obviously an illusion of some description.
So in terms of what she was saying, could she remember clearly, or was her memory hazy?
I would say her memory was clear and hazy.
Right.
When the police actually turned up and spoke to the victim, she was, I would say, lucid. So it wasn't as though she was at that time under the effects of any drug. Cobb had previously said to the victim, "You've only been here a few minutes," but the boyfriend made it clear that she'd been in there at least 30 minutes, and she didn't really understand where the time had gone. She was absolutely certain something had happened, but there was areas of confusion that she wasn't quite sure of.
What's that telling you?
I'm thinking This is difficult to get your head around,
Yeah.
you know, because of the location rather than anything else.
Busy A&E.
Busy A&E, and you've got to ask yourself, how could someone be raped in a busy A&E?
So normal procedures when a rape allegation comes in. So 1999, would you have had SOE-offs? So SOE being sexual offence investigation trained.
Yeah.
So what was it that they would be looking for from the victim when they're examining her?
So you're looking for any way you can forensically attach the victim to the suspect for proof that the rape has taken place. In this instance, there was no physical injuries.
Your starting point when someone comes to report a rape, you've got to believe the victim, haven't you? You've got to do that. But it's only natural for things to creep into your mind around it's a fact that there are allegations that aren't true.
Yes, absolutely.
As a detective, everything you do, you're thinking about courts and a trial and how things play out at a trial. So if you're having these doubts and if you're starting to think, well, how could this happen? You know at some point someone else is going to be asking those questions.
Yeah.
So that's a challenge, isn't it?
A number of the other people at the hospital had a higher level of doubt because they knew Kevin Cobb and they didn't believe Kevin could ever have been responsible for raping someone in an A&E department. The scene was secured. Kevin Cobb was suspended and then shortly after that arrested. And the investigation continued.
What was found within the scene, within the examination room?
Very little, in all honesty. You know, the room was captured in photographs, etc. So we found a syringe with fluid in it, and that was seized and sent off for toxicology. He did say that he had administered a saline flush to the victim, and we asked him about this. He said, well, there was a syringe there with saline close by and it was already prepared, so I just used that. In short, he admitted to professional misconduct in using a syringe that he hadn't prepared.
In allegations of rape, it's really important that detectives understand what's in the system of the victim. Quite often drugs are used to stupefy them. So urine samples and blood samples will be taken from the victim at a very early stage.
So a lot of people concentrate on the blood, but urine's really important, isn't it? Because things last longer in the system in urine than
And that's
blood.
what happened in this case, is there was nothing found in her blood, and it was in her test for the urine that we found the drug midazolam.
Were you aware of what midazolam was when you first started to get the results back?
Well, I can tell you from personal experience.
You've had it yourself?
I've had it myself a few times.
Right.
I've been given it a couple of times for endoscopies, and it's a benzodiazepam. So we identified a Professor Hindmarsh, who coincidentally was at Surrey University, and he was an expert in the drug. So we approached him asking for his assistance in the investigation.
I think you can get some measure of just how powerful a sedative drug midazolam is when you consider midazolam is one of the mixture of drugs that's used in some states for capital punishment purposes. I'm Ian Hindmarsh, and I'm an emeritus professor of human psychopharmacology. In the UK, midazolam has only been marketed to anaesthetists as an anaesthetic induction agent. It's a drug that intravenously, very, very quickly puts you to sleep. And of course, as it's putting you to sleep, the sedation is stopping information getting into the brain. So it's producing this anterograde amnesia, which is useful if you're going to have an endoscopy or something like that, because then if you've had midazolam, you wake up with no memory of the unpleasant experience.
It must have been a surprise to have got that result within the toxicologies. It's not a drug that I would suggest we come across often as police officers.
And that is the thing that hangs there in your head saying, what is this?
There was a syringe found in the room in which the allegation was said to have taken place. What did the toxicology show on that syringe?
It was a drug called, I'm going to get this right, flumanazole.
Midazolam and flumazenil are both benzodiazepines. But whereas midazolam is going to put you to sleep, flumazenil is an antagonist. So it has exactly the opposite effect. If you've finished your surgery, you want to wake the patient up. You put in the flumazenil, so it's really, if you put it in simple terms, it's an antidote.
The existence of this drug in the room has got a greater importance, but you don't understand it until you realise the big picture.
What did Cobb tell you in interview? What was his version of events?
He fell back on the fact that this syringe had been pre-prepared by someone else and he shouldn't have used it, but he did use it, believing it to be saline. And then he started to change the story into, well, it might have been midazolam in the syringe, I don't know. So it was a continual denial, right? But trying to alter the story slightly more in his favour by introducing something that potentially, not saying it was, but potentially could be credible. Cobb was arrested on suspicion of rape, pending further inquiries. His home address was searched. Within his home address, a number of items of prescription drugs were found, but his wife, being a general practitioner, some of them belonged to her. His uniform was recovered, which later became relevant to the allegation of a sexual offence.
If someone was arrested for rape, police then have the power to examine their body, don't they?
And that was done with Cobb. His blood was taken and he would have been physically examined as well. The examination of Cobb's work clothing, and there was traces of midazolam on his trousers, but more importantly, there was also traces of semen on his trousers. The one thing that we had missing between that was any evidence of any physical contact between the victim and Cobb. You have to ask yourself, what's a male nurse doing at work with semen on your trousers, right? I mean, he put the excuse forward that it might have been contaminated through sex with his wife at home because he didn't have sex with anyone else. But it's starting to stretch.
I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but you look at it as a jigsaw puzzle and all these little pieces are starting to fall into place, aren't they? And they're building a picture that is more towards, actually, this is a rape.
This is the value of actually interviewing to get their side of the story. Because once you tell one lie, you've got to tell another lie to cover that lie up. And then before long, your lies don't make sense.
Yeah.
Or you forget what lies you've told.
So sometimes in an investigation, it can take a turn that you're not expecting. And that happened in this case, didn't it? You got a phone call.
Yes, it was anonymous initially, if I remember correctly.
What detail did the anonymous caller give you at the time?
It was telling us to go and look at the death of Susan Annis at the Royal Brompton Hospital 3 years previously, in 1996. The timeline of events is that on the 25th of November 1996, Susan Annis was on a course at the Royal Brompton Hospital and she was living nursing accommodation. Late that evening, she was found unconscious and unresponsive in her room. And she was then taken to accident emergency where she died. The investigation team were told to go up and find out what they could. And they came back with information on her death, which, you know, you looked at and you just thought, wow, you know, this takes it to a different level.
And the biggest one being who was there at the time of her death? Who was...
Kevin Cobb had discovered Susan Annis unconscious, allegedly, and she had midazolam in her system.
I don't know about you, David, but for me, I'm not a strong believer in coincidences.
Right, so you're now looking at potential for a very serious offender here.
When detectives are investigating crimes such as serious sexual offences and murder, it's incumbent upon them to establish whether or not this is an offender's first time. It's a fact that people do commit multiple crimes, multiple murders, multiple serious sexual offences. So they will be looking at the offender's behaviour for any clues as to, well, is this their first time?
So, in terms of her death, so she died, it wasn't in Surrey area, it was in London?
It was in London, so therefore we had to contact the Met and bring the Met, one of their major investigation teams in. It became a joint investigation, and they conducted the investigation into the death of Susan Annis and gathered the evidence, and we continued to conduct the investigation into the rape.
I've dealt with medical professionals in the past, but it's the first time I dealt with an allegation against a nurse who's alleged to have indecently assaulted, raped a patient. My name is Jim Dickey. I was a detective inspector attached to the murder squad at Westminster. It was alleged from the phone call that Kevin Cobb had something to do with Susan Annis's untimely death. And I started to get together the papers of that case, the coroner's notes, and any other evidence that was available, and I started to read through it.
Fate smiled upon us occasions, because when we read Kevin Cobb's statement, he'd committed himself to a course of action. He was there for a course, the same course that Susan Annis was, and they'd been on the ward till about 7:30 in the evening, and they had arranged to go and get a pizza. So they got some food and they brought it back to his room, where he had previously purchased some cans of cider, which he knew she drank, and some cans of beer for himself. She had about 2 or 3 cans of cider, and she started to fall asleep. And he left her there for a wee while, and then eventually he said he helped her back to her room. Then, about a good hour or so later, he was concerned that he hadn't heard from her. So he went up and he found the room open, it wasn't locked, and Susan was lying on the floor, and clear signs that she'd vomited.
He allegedly ran into the corridor and sought help of other medical professionals. He tried to revive her, he was unsuccessful. They moved her into the hospital proper, where they had all the machines for resuscitation, but unfortunately it was of no avail and she died.
Initially, when she was found, her death was treated as being suspicious, and then there was a post-mortem. The cause of death was put down to tachycardia.
She had an irregular heartbeat, which was well documented in her medical records, and I think she was on medication for that.
So the minute it came down as natural causes tachycardia, and then it simply went forward to the coroner's court for the coroner to examine some of the circumstances.
So the procedure around there is that a police officer will prepare a report for the coroner, and then an inquest will be heard to determine
Yes.
a cause of death.
Yes.
And do you know what the cause of death was?
It was left open. The cause of death was tachycardia with no suspicious circumstances.
What about the midazolam that was in her system?
Well, it's a basic question that should have been asked the minute the midazolam was found in her system. What's it doing here, and why was it there? You know, they searched Susan Annis's room and there was no drug paraphernalia. There was nothing to suggest that she had any illegal drugs. There's nothing within her history said that she was a drug abuser in any way.
And she's a nurse, so she understands what would happen if she ingested it.
Absolutely. This needed a bit more investigation.
Which didn't happen.
Which didn't happen.
After reading through the case, I decided then the first thing we needed to do was inform Susan Annis's family that we were going to reopen an investigation. We sat down, they gave us a coffee, and I said to them, Mr. and Mrs. Annis, I've reopened the investigation into your daughter's death. I think it's more than suspicious. I think it's she's come to an untimely death. And it was almost as if a huge weight had been lifted from the room. I remember it to this day. And Mrs. Annis, who sadly now is deceased, said, you don't realise what a weight you've taken from me. I always thought something was not right in this case.
Victimology in a murder investigation is one of the most important aspects for detectives. Ultimately, how a victim died is one of the most important questions for a murder investigation. So you need to understand, is there anything that could have contributed to that within the victim's life? What did you learn about Susan Annis?
This is the sad thing about being an SIO in a murder investigation, is you never get to meet the victim, which makes the whole event so much more tragic. She's the type of person you would expect to be a nurse. Caring, understanding. She'd wanted to be a nurse from early on in life. You know, we never heard anyone speak a bad word about her.
Susan was very bubbly, worked extremely hard, and at the same time was knowledgeable. She was the most popular, I'd say, of the nurses. I'm Dr. John Parsley, a retired GP and hospital doctor. Susan Annis, she was a nursing sister in Crawley Hospital. She started there a few weeks before me, so immediately you've got something in common in that you're both new. So we became friends. We were never boyfriend or girlfriend, but when we went out, for some reason, she usually sat next to me.
She had a very good reputation amongst her colleagues, and in fact, after the death, they named a ward after her.
It was a completely unexpected event, and the information they got given was that Sue had gone to a party and had drugs and had passed out and died. And that was not anywhere near the real course of events. I kept in contact with her boyfriend at the time, and I said I would go with him to the inquest. And that's when I got more information and realised there was a big problem. As part of the information given out, it was that Susan had had midazolam, a sedative drug, in her blood and in her stomach. I spoke to her GP afterwards, and we both looked at each other outside and said, this is wrong, this can't be right. So for it to get in her system, in the stomach, she would have had to swallow the intravenous preparation. And I couldn't think of any reason why somebody would do that.
There was certainly no evidence of an ampule of midazolam, because he would have had to have an ampule of midazolam, because it's the only way he had access to midazolam, and it's a glass ampule that you break, and of course that has to be disposed of somehow. That was never found.
Why would somebody go out their way to swallow this stuff and then get rid of the glass ampules when they could do it in the morning? So that didn't make sense either. But the next day I was back working in Crawley, and I rang Guy's Poison Centre, and I asked them about the drugs, midazolam, that type of drug, benzodiazepine, because I did know from previous work that sometimes the effect of it differs depending on what route you took it, whether it was injected or swallow.
One further thing that was overlooked was the fact that when mixed with alcohol, midazolam becomes more potent.
Mixing midazolam with alcohol will really magnify the effects of the midazolam. This is because this special benzodiazepine receptor we have in the brain also is affected by alcohol. So what you've got is you've got the midazolam holding open the lift doors. Along comes alcohol and it jams the doors open. So you get a massive increase in sedation. Then the effects on your heart are going to be quite profound if you've taken enough of it.
Now that is a crucial factor. It was more than a trace, let's put it that way, and it would have had an adverse effect to somebody taken together with cider and that had a irregular heartbeat.
How was Susan laid to rest? What happened with Susan?
I believe Susan was cremated.
Right.
And the reason I say that is because we then needed to go back and have some tests conducted in relation to the midazolam, etc. And because she'd been cremated, that was no longer possible.
That's a hard barrier to get over.
It is. Very, very much so.
The funeral was very interesting looking back. The whole room was taken up full and the crowd spilled with just as many people, actually more people, had to wait outside. So that's how popular she was.
Kevin Cobb was treated very sympathetically. Everyone thought that he'd done his best to revive Susan, so much so that at Susan's funeral, Susan's parents went up to him and thanked him for trying to save their daughter.
Kevin Cobb come up to me with tears in his eyes and said how sorry it was that Sue had passed away. And then he actually went to speak to Sue's mother, Audrey. And she said, well, she was glad that she had a friend there when she died, present at the time.
I mean, that speaks volumes to his psyche, doesn't it?
That's the characteristics of a psychopath and a predator. You know, I'll never get caught. Confidence, arrogance.
In his head, it probably felt like the perfect crime.
At the time it was, because he was getting away with it.
When serious offences occur within a workplace, be it a hospital, a police station or any other business, there are conflicting interests at play. On the one hand, detectives are trying to establish exactly what happened, but those from within the business premises have their own interests. For instance, how is this going to look on the outside to the public, or how is it going to impact on our day-to-day business? And this can be a real challenge for detectives.
I don't know about you, David, but for me, I tend to don't believe that someone gets caught first time doing stuff.
If the allegation was true, which we had to accept the statement of the victim, then this wouldn't have been a one-off. And we weren't allowed to access personally the hospital records to see who Cobb had attended to over the last 24, 48, 72 hours, etc.
That must be frustrating, because in your mind you've got potentially a serial rapist here with victims, and because of the circumstances they might not even know they're victims.
Correct.
That must be hard.
What they agreed to do was send a letter out to the patients once they'd identified them and ask them if there's anything they wish to come forward with.
And did that?
We didn't get anything.
One of the most important aspects of the investigation would be to develop a timeline of his life, particularly where and when he was working.
An important element of this investigation would be to understand Cobb, his background. What did that show?
He did work at a number of hospitals before St. Peter's. He was someone who had a high degree of intelligence, and I would say that he was into, a degree of exhibitionism.
Right.
Because in one of his previous partners, he liked to have sex in public places, etc., where there's a degree of risk involved. I think sex was his main focus in life. That's what drove him.
Having spoken to other people, other nurses and doctors that had worked with him, they said, some of the nurses said he was into risky sex, like he'd have sex with other nurses on wards, in cupboards at the hospital. I'm not saying it's wrong per per se. It's certainly not unlawful, but it's not, shall we say, how a nurse should behave when at work.
Yeah, well, after Susan's case, time passed, and obviously I was very, very unhappy about it. And then, but I was friends with other nurses, and in particular, one was retiring, and she rang me up and said, I've got a retirement party in a couple of weeks' time. I'd like you to be there. And she said, we were just chatting, and she said, oh, Kevin's in trouble again. And I said, what's he done now? And she said, well, he's been accused of sexually assaulting patients. The police say that the girls had midazolam in their system. I rang the police in Surrey and I left an anonymous message, and then a few days later I had a call from the police, and the chap said, I'm Detective Chief Inspector Dickey, and I said to him, I'll be waiting for you to ring. And he said, right, well, you've answered my first question. Is you definitely made the phone call to the police? Yes, I did.
Jim Dickey had researched the case, seen my misgivings, and suspected that I might have been the anonymous caller.
We later found out the identity of this caller. He was a Dr. Parsley, who had been a family friend of Susan Annis and was clearly unhappy at what he'd heard in relation to her death. And this was an opportunity to try and help put things straight.
I needed to examine or get examined Susan Annis's stomach contents to ascertain whether there was midazolam in that stomach contents or not. I'd been told by the toxicologist that she believed midazolam was in the stomach contents because she had examined it on behalf of the coroner. But I needed to double check and have that looked at by a forensic scientist. That was very, very important and almost crucial evidence. It's unusual to keep an exhibit 3 years after the event unless you have suspicions that something's not quite right. I made a phone call to a toxicologist at Charing Cross Hospital where Susan's body was taken for autopsy. I asked the toxicologist, I said, you haven't by any chance still got Susan Annis's stomach contents? And she immediately said, hang on a minute, I'll just go and have a look in my fridge. And I was left hanging on the phone. A couple of minutes later, she came back. She said, yes, I've still got them. They're in a bag, forensically sealed, in my fridge. And I asked her, isn't that strange that you've kept it? She said, not really. I thought the whole case was strange and I didn't agree with the coroner's findings. That's why I kept the stomach contents.
Sometimes in cases like this, with the death of Susan Annis, those involved have nagging doubts. Something just doesn't sit right. There's something behind this that I can't quite put my finger on, but it's just not right. And this is illustrated in no better way by the toxicologist who kept the stomach contents of Susan. It's really unusual. It's not something that you would see on a day-to-day basis. And that was a real turning point for this investigation. And my understanding around that is that that was quite an unusual circumstance, wasn't it?
Well, we thought so, but it was retained and it was another bonus for the investigation. The midazolam from our samples gave us a more accurate picture.
So at that stage, where were you at?
In discussions with the Met, there was a decision made that he was going to be arrested for the murder of Susan Annis.
We went early one morning and we arrested him on his front door. He tried to shut the door on me. I put my foot in the door, pushed it open, and we went in. I told him as soon as I knocked on the door, I'm investigating the death of Susan Annis. He was really shocked. He literally went white, and now that we'd linked them, he clearly realised that the game was up.
So, against the advice of the press office, I then spoke with the journalist and we told the journalist the story about the rape We told the journalist a story about Susan Annis, and there's a 3-year gap, and that there must be people in between.
The press office weren't happy with it.
No,
But you've got a different consideration, haven't you?
I had reached the stage where I no longer had to consider the reputation of the hospital. I had to consider, the victims and solving this crime. And lo and behold, we had about 3 or 4 people came forward with similar concerns to Susan Annis. We were able to focus on 3 of the new complaints to add to a growing case against Cobb.
What did those ladies say?
Actually very similar to the victim in the rape. And they remember being attended to by a male nurse. They believed that they had been indecently assaulted, but it was all a haze to them. We had one lady at the time that she believes the incident happened was round about the same time she conceived her newborn, and of course we were concerned it was Cobb, but thankfully it wasn't.
Proving a rape at a trial in front of a jury is hard work. You were presented with victims that there was no evidence of sexual encounter because they weren't examined at the time.
Correct.
No toxicology was taken, so you didn't know what was in their system. So this must have been...
Oh, even worse than that. They believed themselves that something had happened, but they couldn't really remember, their memory was hazy by virtue of the fact the amnesiac effect midazolam had. So they were sure something happened, but they weren't quite sure, if that makes sense.
It's a huge barrier to get over, isn't it?
Oh, it was massive. Yes, we believed them. We had to find a way of presenting the case so that the jury believed them as well.
For those investigating Susan Annis's death, they never had what you would class as a smoking gun. What they had to do was build a circumstantial case. Quite often this is misunderstood, that circumstantial evidence isn't as good. Well, it can be, and especially when you bring enough of it together. And that's exactly what they did.
There was no way on earth could we get any forensic samples from them to prove that they'd been injected with midazolam. So what turned out was, instead of a forensic examination of the victim, we had a forensic examination of the victim's statement. So we relied heavily on their account of what happened to them and Professor Hindmarsh's interpretation of their account to say that beyond all reasonable doubt they have had midazolam in their system. We knew through records that Kevin Cobb had been the nurse that attended to these women. Professor Hindmarsh was then able to analyse the women's statements to then prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they had unlawfully been given midazolam during that stay.
The sort of evidence I was giving was basically to explain to the jury what the drugs are likely to be doing. I know of no drug on earth that will give rise to hallucinations of rape. That's too specific.
There was enough evidence after consulting with the CPS to charge Kevin Cobb with the murder of Susan Annis. The trial took place at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey. It was murder initially. It was dropped down to manslaughter. The circumstances of manslaughter were far, far better than that of murder. So it was the appropriate one for him to stand trial on. We were also able to bring charges relating to 3 of the female victims who had been seen in hospital by Cobb. So in addition to the manslaughter charge, Cobb was also charged with 4 charges of drugging women with intent to rape and 2 offences of rape. Kevin Cobb had to run the gauntlet of press outside the Old Bailey every day that he turned up. And of course that brought him more into the public eye because they could actually photograph him.
But he was a face that people could see.
He was a face that people could see.
How did he act? What was his demeanour?
He didn't show emotion at all in any of it when I was sitting in court. The trial lasted for 4 weeks. 3 women gave evidence at the trial. all our victims stood up and gave good evidence to the court. The explanations given by Cobb weren't credible.
His defence was, it's all a big mistake, I didn't do any of it. And Susan Annis died because she had an irregular heartbeat. Well, we called 2 professors of toxicology to tell the jury what the effect of midazolam is on the human body, what the effect of midazolam is when taken with cider and with somebody with an irregular heartbeat. And all the victims came and gave evidence from St Peter's Hospital, other medical professionals gave evidence, and of course the clincher is the pathologist saying, yes, this definitely would have caused death.
David, what happened on the night of Susan Annis's death?
He put that drug into Susan Annis's drink with the intention of seriously sexually assaulting or raping Susan Annis. But what he didn't plan for was the heart problem that Susan Annis had in her reaction to the midazolam, which is why later on at the hospital, you've got the antidote sitting there very close to the victim of rape in case something goes wrong.
So there's almost some learning on his part there, isn't there?
I would say so.
It went wrong before, what can I do next time?
Correct. He couldn't afford someone else to die with midazolam in them.
This is a crucial bit, and we'll never know, and the only 2 people that know this is Susan Annis is dead, and the other one is Kevin Cobb. How long it took him to alert other medical professionals to Susan's problem. No one knows. He says straight away, I don't believe that. I think it was at least 5 to 10 minutes, and that is crucial when you're trying to save a life of somebody.
Were you there for the verdict?
I was there for the verdict.
Describe that moment to me when you're in court and the court staff come back to say, we have a verdict, and you're sat there and you're waiting and you don't know which way it's going to go.
Nail biting if you had any nails left at that time.
So what was the final result from the trial?
Cobb was found guilty, and as a result of being found guilty of the offences, he was sentenced to 7 life terms. He was given a life sentence for each of the 7 charges relating to 4 victims, including Susan Annis.
It was unanimous on all counts. Cobb looked shocked, he white, drained. There was no triumphalism by the Annis family, very dignified throughout, very dignified. I'm most proud of the fact I got justice for the Annis family, and the true circumstances were explained, and although we'll never be able to bring their daughter back, we got them closure. They got an explanation.
Kevin Cobb was an out-and-out predator. His time with Susan Annis wasn't the first. So this man had no compassion, no feelings towards his victims whatsoever. He's designed a system where he can rape someone who forgets what's happened. You know, if it wasn't for the victim waking up in a hospital in the A&E, he might still have been doing it now.
I could say this from the outsider looking in. This was a fantastic piece of investigation. You went from having what was a difficult case to prove to going on to 7 life sentences.
Thank you. I think we've got to say that a lot of good work was done by the team. It's also a bit of luck. Dr. Parsley phoning in. He had nagging doubts at the time of the inquest. He had nagging doubts at the time midazolam was found in her system. And he held on to these nagging doubts, and for that we're eternally grateful.
Without him?
Without him, I'm not sure we'd have connected the dots.
I do think back to the times I was in Crawley Hospital when obviously she was there, and I just think it's such a waste of a life. And I always wondered what she would be doing now. She was doing a paediatric nursing course so that she could look after sick children in A&E, and she was in the process of setting up a separate department to deal with children. But of course, that was something that came along later, after she had died. So one thing I can say is that I'm very happy that I followed this up, did the appropriate research, and let the appropriate authorities know. If you're unhappy about something, and I obviously was, then you have to persist.
Sometimes in cases like this, it only takes one person to change the whole course of an investigation. And in this case, Dr. John Parsley and his anonymous tip undoubtedly changed the whole course of this investigation. Ultimately, it led to the truth. It led to justice, and for Susan's family to get the answers that they needed.